things. We had an order from the Supreme Court declaring a judicial emergency and giving the president, judges a lot of power to declare their own judicial emergencies, which every county did, every judicial district did, and what they could do and suspend, even things like suspending certain rules within constitutional limitations. So we did sort of an immediate shutdown of the physical facilities, and we only kept going at that time the essential operations, which we defined as orders for protection from abuse, so that victims of domestic violence and intimate partner violence would have access to the courts to be able to file and be safe. Pretty much most of the juvenile court matters were deemed essential matters because those are cases in which we're either detaining juveniles who have been accused of a crime or dependency cases where we may be looking at the safety of children in their own homes and removing children from the care of their parents. So we're very blessed to have a stellar IT department, and what we did was quickly use Microsoft Teams as the method to conduct hearings remotely. So since April, for example, I primarily hear juvenile court cases. I hear some other family division matters. I have been doing all my hearings remotely, except for those hearings where a person has a right to confrontation and wants an in-court hearing, then we have to have those. We did things like purchase plexiglass to put up in the courtrooms and court facilities. We put occupancy signs on every door. We now have temperature machines installed and things like that. So we then slowly began to bring back cases into the courthouse to do more things in the courthouse. So at this point, we're pretty much doing in the family division, pretty much everything is remote except for the protection from abuse, the emergency or the temporary orders. Plaintiffs can still come to the courthouse to file their petition because it's an emergency basis, and so those are not scheduled events, so they have to have access to the courthouse. Juvenile delinquency cases where the juvenile defendant wants an in-court hearing, we will give him an in-court hearing. And then we also have, we do the special immigrant juvenile status hearings, and some of those are part of the cases. Some of the witnesses are in the courthouse and some of them are testifying remotely. And I believe the judge is in the courthouse to hear those. And we have designated spaces in each of our courthouses where it's safe to socially distance. As big as we think our courtrooms are, when we actually started to measure them out about social distancing, we realized they were not big enough. One of the things that we tried to do early on is to address the issue of inmates incarcerated in our county jail. And so we started with a plan to try to look at every inmate in the county jail to see who could be released and maintain the safety in the community. We started with a list that was provided by our warden of the most vulnerable inmates in the jail, those who, because of age or health issues and so forth, would be at serious risk for serious illness or death if they contracted COVID. So we started there. And then we also looked at other inmates, looking at the charges, why they were detained. We had many motions filed by the Office of the Public Defender and Defense Counsel. And within a short period of time, we released over 1,200 inmates from the county jail to reduce the population in the jail. And pretty much for several months, in terms of the inmate population, we have not had a positive COVID test, an inmate test positive for COVID in several months now. We're having an issue with the staff outbreak of COVID, but not the inmates in the county jail. So we have been able to maintain them. I will say, interestingly, though, we did reduce the number of inmates in the jail, but that did not correct the issue of disproportionality. So it's still an issue that we need to look at. So even though we reduced, we let out released more than 1,200 inmates from the county jail, the actual disproportionality percentages went up. So it's still an issue that we have to address. And we really look at that every day. We look at the numbers every day. We see as many people that we can get out. We try to get them out. We have really asked our magisterial district judges, who are the ones that are usually initially setting bail, to try to really focus on the issue of public safety. This is the reason that someone should be detained, as opposed to other reasons. So we're really trying to do that. We did try to make the criminal court system accessible by other ways. So for example, we cleared a lot of bench warrants. Defendants that had bench warrants for failure to appear, they could call in, and we would then give them a new date and vacate the warrant so that they wouldn't have to come in. So we did a lot of things like that. And I was really pleased. It was a very big collaborative effort. It was the jail, it was our pretrial services department in criminal court, it was the judges, the magisterial district judges, and certainly the public defender, district attorney, and defense counsel. So it was really a good process by which we did that. And so we're still working on it. Nothing is perfect. And so as we go on, we did not expect the pandemic. Of course, I think back in March, I didn't expect that we would still be in this mode. The numbers, of course, all over the United States are rising. We did resume jury trials in October, but I did shut them down again temporarily because the numbers are so high. We're concerned, and especially now with people coming back from the Thanksgiving holiday. But our county manager and county executive offered us our convention center to utilize for jury selection because nothing else was going on in the convention center. And so it's a nice, safe place to select the juries because there's a lot of room. We got very positive feedback from the people who were called and served on juries during that short period of time, that they felt very safe and that if they were asked again, they would do it again. So we were really pleased that that was offered to us in terms of the jury selection process. We also moved our traffic court to the convention center because that's sort of a high volume thing and there was so much space there. It worked out really well. And traffic court is actually still going on right now. So those are kind of the steps that we have taken so far to address COVID. We have had, like many others, court staff and other people coming into the building that have our buildings that have tested positive. So we try to keep the public informed. We post all positive tests on the website. We do our own contact tracing in addition to our health department, which is much more extensive. We don't look at just we go beyond what the health department and CDC would, so that people can make their own determination whether they need to go get tested or self-quarantine, even if they've only had sort of minimal contact. And we post that that information on our court website so that the public can see it.
Thank you so very, very much. The next speaker is Nazgol Ghandnoosh. Nazgol, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes, terrifically.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I'm a senior researcher at the Sentencing Project. We're a research and advocacy organization based in DC. And recently I have been up to a couple things that are relevant to our discussion today. So I worked with Dr. Carlos Franco Paredes, who's speaking later today, and we put together an analysis that we published in the journal Lancet Infectious Diseases about the level of decarceration that's happened so far in prisons, jails, immigration detention centers around the country, and I'll share with you some of those results. And I also recently have been working with my colleagues at the Drug Policy Alliance to bring together medical experts and public health experts to raise their voices in recommending much more dramatic decarceration than has happened so far. And this is a letter that we're going to be sharing with the COVID advisory board that the President-elect Biden has put together, and that should be coming out in the next day or two. And I'm just going to share my email address with you here so that if you're not on our email list at the Sentencing Project, feel free to email me and I can add you, or just go on our website and get added. And I'd be happy to share some of these materials with you. So I'm going to share my screen with you because I want to show a couple of slides. Let's see. All right, here we go. So I'm going to talk to you about why, if we really want to meaningfully decarcerate during this pandemic, we have to be willing to scale back sentences for violent crimes. And I'm going to tell you about why that makes sense from a criminological perspective, given that people that have especially served long sentences for violent crimes are at a very low risk of recidivating when they're released. And I'm also going to emphasize this population because of how much of an impact it would have on our levels of incarceration. And because this population, especially older people in prison that have served substantial prison terms, are especially at high risk of serious illness or death from COVID. So let's get started. So this is a chart that probably many of you are familiar with, which shows the growth in the prison population in the United States. And this is just prisons. It doesn't include people in jails. And you can see that our problem of mass incarceration is a relatively recent one that started in the 1970s, and that we've made some progress, which you can begin to notice in the recent years of reducing the overall prison population. And so in particular, the prison population increased by about 500% in the last 4 decades. And then since 2009, it's been declining. And by the end point shown here, there was a 9% reduction. Since between 2018 and 2019, there was another 2% reduction. So really, we've made a turn after nearly consistent growth in the prison population for 4 decades. We're in a very different climate now of much more willingness to reconsider prison sentences and lengthy prison sentences, but we've just barely begun to make a dent into this. And that's where we were basically when the pandemic hit us in our correctional institutions. So I want to point out here, just as background, that when we look at the growth in incarceration levels, I think it makes sense to ask, well, how does this relate to changes in crime rates? And what's important to realize is that crime rates in the United States are about half the level they used to be at in the 1990s when they reached their peak levels. In most urban areas, if you look, and around the country, homicide rates are about half the level that they used to be at in the mid-90s. But on the other hand, we continue to grow our incarceration levels until 2009, when things finally started to turn around. So some people might think about that as an obviously problematic thing. Some people might think about that as, well, it's because of the increase in incarceration levels that we've reduced crime rates. But analyses that have looked at this question at the state level, and especially that have looked at this internationally, have shown that the United States has not been alone in experiencing an uptick in crime rates in the 1970s, 80s, until the 90s, and then a dramatic decline in crime rates since then. There's about 24 other countries that you can look at that follow the exact same pattern, but the United States is exceptional in coming up with this problem of mass incarceration that as a solution to our the crime uptick that we experience, and we've yet to undo it. So why have we made so little progress in reducing incarceration levels, given the more welcoming climate for reform that we have now? And I think that the answer to this lies with the answer to this question, which is what is the proportion of the prison population that's serving time for a drug offense? I want you to, the audience here, I would love for you to think about what your answer is to this question. What percentage of people that are in prison do you think are there because of a drug conviction as their most serious offense? So think about it for a second. I really want you to have a number before I tell you. And okay, and the actual number is 18%. When you look at people in prison, 18% of them have a drug conviction as their most serious offense. Half of the prison population are there for a violent conviction, and about another roughly 17% are there for property crimes, and the rest are there for public order offenses. So when we look at who's in prison, if we just think about scaling back and reducing prison terms for people convicted of nonviolent crimes, we can't make a big enough dent into mass incarceration. And I just do want to add a footnote to this to say that a lot of people are in prison because of the drug war that aren't included in my 18% figure. And that's because, well, we have limited access to drug treatment, and a lot of people going to prison commit their crimes in order to sustain addictions or under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And had they had treatment, we might have been able to divert them from that route. In addition to that, a lot of people on probation or parole supervision for a more serious offense get knocked back into prison if they're found to have drugs in their system or in their possession, even in states where, for example, medical or marijuana might be legalized. This can send someone back to prison, but they would be counted as being there for their most serious underlying conviction. So just, I promise I'm going to show you fewer graphs in a few minutes, but just a little bit more in terms of the data. This is a chart that shows you the growth in the prison population broken down by offense type. And this is the number of people in prison for violent crimes, for drug crimes, and for property crimes. And you can see that the violent crime number, the line is much higher because there are a lot more people in prison for a violent conviction. And then the lines for drug and property crimes are lower. And this analysis is to show you how much we've reduced the prison population for each of these conviction types. We've made the most progress in reducing the number of people in prison for a drug conviction. We've made also considerable progress in reducing the number of people in prison for a property crime, but we've been very modest in scaling back the number of people in prison for a violent crime. And that has a lot to do with the very lengthy prison sentences that people are serving for violent convictions. So I promised that I would share with you the analysis that I did with Dr. Franco Paredes about how much we've reduced incarceration levels during the pandemic. And here it is. And this is actually a version that was reproduced in an analysis that was done by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. It was this was an analysis that was called, this report was called Decarcerating Correctional Facilities During COVID-19. And I recommend taking a look at that as a resource. Emily Wang was a co-chair of the committee that put that analysis together. And so what you can see here is that the number of people in state prisons, this is working with the best data that we have in terms of the beginning and end points. Number of people in state prisons declined by 4% during the pandemic. The number in federal prisons declined by 10.5%. And actually since then, there's been more of a decline. So there's been about a 14% decline in the federal prison population during the pandemic. That's doing much better than the state prison population, but keep in mind that that's within the context of the federal prison population growing by 600% between 1980 to 2019. So there's really still quite a ways to go. The number of people in jails has declined by about 22%, but in many jurisdictions, they've begun to reverse that trend and increase their populations since making the declines that happened early on in the pandemic. And immigration detention facilities have reduced their populations by about 44%. So overall, when you put all these numbers together, what we found is that there's been an 11% reduction in the incarcerated population in the United States during the time of the pandemic. And we see this as insufficient. And I want to share with you this overview of a report that I produced at the Sentencing Project recently that was called The Next Step. And it tries to make a case for why we need to scale back sentences for violent crimes and identifies some jurisdictions around the country that have made some progress towards this goal. And so here are some examples. Remember, I promised fewer graphs, so here we are. So on the top left is a picture of District Attorney Larry Krasner and State Senator Sharif Street. And so I want to just give you a quick overview of some of the reforms that the folks pictured here have undertaken or are pursuing. So DA Krasner has moved to reduce sentencing plea offers that are given to people that are being resentenced who were convicted as juveniles, and going below what the state has provided in its sentencing guidelines in certain cases, and instructed his prosecutors to not always bring the heaviest homicide charge that they can in a case, but to consider really what's appropriate for individual cases. Because if you bring a first-degree homicide charge in a case in Pennsylvania, that's going to carry a life without parole sentence if you get that conviction. State Senator Sharif Street has been an advocate for a second look bill that actually is going through the DC Council. And the second look bill in Pennsylvania is more modest, but allows for people sentenced to life without parole to petition a court for resentencing after they've served a considerable portion of their lives in prison. On the right is Brian Stevenson, who's successfully argued several cases reducing the use of juvenile life without parole sentences in the United States. On the bottom right is Rick Ramish, who, when he was head of corrections in Colorado, limited the use of solitary confinement in that state to a maximum of 2 weeks, and only for serious violations of prison rules like acts of violence. On the bottom left is Jack Wilson. He's a defense attorney in California, and he's advocating there for a bill that was passed in California to scale back the felony murder bill, the felony murder law there, so that fewer people would get sentences of 25 years to life under the law there. And in the middle is pictured a group of women that are part of Hearts for Inmates. It's a South Carolina-based advocacy organization, and they are advocating for scaling back the truth in sentencing requirement in that state from 85 to 65%. So meaning that after someone has served 65% of their sentence, they're eligible for release rather than 85%. And that's modeled in part after a reform that was implemented in Mississippi to scale back that state's truth in sentencing requirement. So these are just a couple examples of efforts that we see around the country to recognize that we have overshot, in terms of sentences, and in particular, the lengths of sentences for violent crimes. So I wanted to show you this picture here of a group of individuals that were released from prison in Maryland as a result of the Unger versus Maryland case in 2012. There have been now over 200 people released as a result of that decision in Maryland. If it weren't for this case, which was focused on problematic jury instructions during the time of their conviction, almost all of these individuals would surely still be incarcerated, because the parole process in Maryland is so broken that hardly anybody is released there. And I think that this is a notable picture because you can see that these are elderly people. You can see that they're disproportionately men. They're overwhelmingly in this picture African-American, and that's true for most of the people serving life sentences in Maryland. And I think all of this goes to show a couple things. There are a couple things you can see from this. One of them is that
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you wrap it up in about a minute? And that's because Ms. Shubik-Richards has to cut out a little early.
Definitely, okay. I can. So as elderly people, most people that have served long sentences for violent crimes are at very low recidivism rates. People age out of crime after they leave their mid-20s, and so they're very low risk of recidivating. And as disproportionately people of color, I think it shows the challenge that we face in getting the broader public to realize the importance of scaling back penalties for these kinds of offenses. And so here, I just wanted to conclude by showing you and giving you access to this website that we created at the Sentencing Project as part of our campaign to end life imprisonment. And what we advocate for is greater recognition that long sentences are not effective deterrents. They are incapacitating people who are no longer a public safety risk and preventing us from making more effective investments in public safety. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Claire Shubik-Richards is Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Prison Society. Claire, I know you're sorry for the short shrift initially. Okay, thank you.
Well, Katti, thank you for, first of all, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. Well, thank you for including me, and thank you for including Judge Clark, and it's lovely to be on a panel with somebody from the Sentencing Project, an organization we've done a lot of work with. I'm gonna speak briefly about what the Prison Society is, the Pennsylvania Prison Society is, what we've done during COVID, which is why I get to be accompanied today by President Judge Clark, and then just answer questions. So what is the Pennsylvania Prison Society? We are the nation's oldest human rights organization. We were founded in 1787 by Dr. Benjamin Rush, the nation's first doctor, and by Benjamin Franklin. I have a little prop with me. As you can see, I'm not in the office today, but this is our history up through 1930. Our history has not been written since 1930, but you get a sense of our longevity. Since our founding, our mission has been to alleviate, the way our mission was stated in 1787 was to alleviate the miseries that are the natural attendants of prisons. In other words, to alleviate inhumane prison conditions and to restore our fellow creatures to lives of virtue and happiness. Our founding fathers had a conviction that prisons in this new country, in this democracy, would be humane places, and that the criminal legal system would be used to restore our fellow creatures to lives of virtue and happiness. So that is the mission that we have been living into since for 234 years, and we continue this mission today. The current pandemic is our fourth pandemic that the Prison Society has endured and carried out our mission through. We have three primary ways that we effectuate our mission. The first is that we serve as the ombuds for corrections in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So by law, we're permitted to go into every jail and prison licensed by the Commonwealth and interview privately people on the inside who have concerns. And we've continued that through the pandemic. I was just looking at our numbers for today. We've dispatched our volunteer ombuds to respond to about 1,600 individual complaints from incarcerated people during the pandemic. In some facilities, we are going in person. In other facilities, we are speaking over the phone or via video conference. The second way that we effectuate our mission is we help maintain or build supports for people who are incarcerated with their communities on the outside. We have a long-standing practice of helping families stay connected when a loved one is incarcerated. And the third way we effectuate our mission is to advocate for policies and practices that are consistent with our goals. So what have we done during this pandemic? Well, the first thing we did was we joined with the ACLU of Pennsylvania in petitioning the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania to please order the release of medically vulnerable people in county jails. And the Supreme Court declined to issue a direct order to the counties across the Commonwealth, but they did issue a fairly strongly worded statement encouraging courts around the Commonwealth to decarcerate when their jail density would not allow for social distancing. So we were grateful that the Supreme Court issued that order. That was in April. But we were skeptical whether any of the counties were actually following through on it. And so with our colleagues at the Vera Institute, we set about to find out, were county jails around the Commonwealth actually decarcerating? And that's how we came to speak to Judge Clark. I think that was back in June, because Allegheny County, many jails throughout the Commonwealth were decarcerating, and Allegheny County was the largest jail that was decarcerating to such a big degree. And so if I'm allowed to share my screen, we're going to find out if I can, and we're going to see how difficult it is when you have lots of tabs up to share the right screen. So it's not letting me share the right screen. Hold on a second, because this will be helpful if I can show it to you. Here we go. Now hopefully I will be permitted to share my screen. Yes. So what you should hopefully see here is an interactive map that we've put together with our friends at the Vera Institute, showing you the degree of decarceration in the Commonwealth 62 jails. There are 67 jails, 67 counties in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. 62 of them have their own jails. What you see here, as I'm dragging my mouse, shows you the change in population from the last day of February through June. We're currently in the process of updating this through October. So what we found when we went out to see if counties were in fact heeding the Supreme Court's directive is that yes, by and large they were. So then we wanted to ask a very similar question to the question that the Sentencing Project was asking. How are they choosing to decarcerate? And are there longer term lessons that may continue on from the pandemic? And so we called a selection of judges in both urban and rural counties to ask them, how did you go about this unprecedented change? Like the rest of the country, in the Commonwealth, there's been a 25% reduction in the number of people in county jails. 8,000 fewer people are incarcerated today than there were in February. And we wanted to know, how did this come about? How did judges make these decisions? How did jail officials make these decisions? And were any of these decisions things that might continue on past the pandemic? And I think we were particularly struck by our conversation with Judge Clark. First of all, because Allegheny County took this so seriously and worked so collaboratively together. I'm going to contrast that to the city where I currently live. I used to live out in Pittsburgh, but now I live in Philly, where we have a number of very dedicated members of our criminal justice community. But the degree of collaboration that was achieved in Allegheny proves elusive for us here. And so as you might see, if I go over to Allegheny here, what you're going to see over here in Philadelphia, though good, is not as dramatic progress. So the first thing was just the degree of dedication and collaboration and resources that Allegheny put into this. For example, getting laptops for all of the public defenders and making sure that hearings could go on remotely, really commandeering the resources and making this a priority. The other thing that was really remarkable to us in our conversation with Judge Clark was in our petition with the ACLU to the Supreme Court, we had asked the court to think about incarcerated people based on their legal status. So as most of you know, in a county jail, a certain number of people are there pre-trial. They've not been convicted of a crime and they're being held while they await trial. In Pennsylvania, even more so than in other states, there are a certain number of people that are in on sentences. In most states, you're only going to be in a county jail for a sentence of 1 year or less. In Pennsylvania, that's 2 years or less. And then there's another group of people that are in because they failed to pay fines and fees. They're in because they violated terms of community supervision. And we had asked the Supreme Court in our petition, in part, to look at people incarcerated by their legal status. And we had a hierarchy. Okay, people who've been convicted of a crime are more likely to need to be in prison than people who are in awaiting trial. And perhaps the court could order the release of people in awaiting trial. What was fascinating to us when we spoke to the judge and her fellow stakeholders in Allegheny County, the county manager, the county executive, people from the defenders, was that they actually looked at people not necessarily from their legal status, but from their criminal history, their propensity to be a public safety risk if they were on the street, and their medical vulnerability. So really asking related questions, but different questions than we had anticipated that they would be asking. So the first thing that we did back in March and April was we looked to see if people could be released, if people could get out of this dangerous situation. The second thing we did was for people that are staying in, we wanted to get a sense of what the Commonwealth, both the State Department of Corrections and the 62 county jails would be doing to mitigate the spread of the virus on the inside. So what you see here, and this is all on our website, which I hope Katti may put up, www.prisonsociety.org. This is our COVID-19 landing page. What you see here is our map tracking the spread of the virus in the prisons and jails throughout the Commonwealth. Right now, there has been viral spread in all 23 state prisons, and at last count, when I counted just before getting on this conference call, 31 of the 62 county prison facilities had reported that the virus had breached the prison walls. As I mentioned earlier, we serve as a support for families of incarcerated people who are working to stay connected to their loved ones on the inside. So in addition to publishing this map, which we hope is a resource for journalists, researchers, and family members wanting to know what's happening in the prison where their loved one is incarcerated. And you can see here, I'm just picking Indiana County at random, but we have a write-up on each county and what we know about the prisons in that county and resources for families in the individual counties. In addition to that, we started an FAQ section with frequently asked questions that we were getting from families around the Commonwealth. To date, we fielded about 6,000 individual inquiries from worried family members. We think we would have fielded a lot more had we not put up this FAQ section. But for the journalists on this call, if you want to see what the concerns of the families are, what they're really focusing on, you'll find that up here on our FAQ section. And we also started pushing out weekly updates about viral spread and mitigation and other developments in the Commonwealth. As I mentioned, we serve as the ombuds, so we're primarily responding to requests for assistance related to a variety of issues. The number one issue that we were asked to respond to before the pandemic is the same issue that we're asked to respond to now, and that's access to medical care. About a quarter of the requests we receive every month are for people in prison asking for assistance accessing medical care. The keynote speaker spoke about the copay. The copay is alive and well in Pennsylvania. The majority of our counties charge a copay for accessing medical care. Several have suspended the copay during the virus, including our state institutions, which have a $5 copay, have suspended it. But what we are asking our legislators in Harrisburg to do is to ban the copay going forward. I guess the one other thing that I will mention is that, as I mentioned, we primarily serve as an ombuds, but we really wanted to be able to paint a more holistic picture about what life in prison is like and to be able to pinpoint systemic issues. And so let's see if this is going to let me do this. I think I have to stop my share and then I will start it again. Stop share, and then I will start it again. And so starting in April, we sent a survey into all Pennsylvania prisons and jails. And I'm going to get that up here momentarily. Oh, no, I'm not. And you can find that on our report page. I'm trying to get it up here so I can show it to you, and I may be able to. We have to date received about 2,000 responses to our survey. The majority of those are from people serving time in state facilities. And what we have learned, let's see if I can get that to be full screen, and then I can share it with you. Okay, too many tabs. I'm going to attempt to share this with you, but you're going to see it in a not fabulous way. One moment, please. Then I will wrap up, share screen. Here we go. Okay, so you'll see that on our report page at the Prison Society. And you know what our preliminary findings are. We're working on a follow-up, were that by and large in Pennsylvania state prisons, the prisons system was doing what it said it would do. It was getting people access to hand washing. It was keeping people quarantined in their cells. But there were a couple of areas where, let's see, am I allowed to do this? Where we saw that the prison, that what the prisons system was reporting publicly was not what was actually happening behind bars. And that was primarily in two areas. The first was in getting people cleaning products. The second was related, I'm gonna stop this, it's just not working. Stop share. The second was in communicating with people on the inside what was going on. So what we saw was about half of the people who answered our survey reported that they did not feel safe. And whether or not you felt safe was correlated to whether or not the prison was communicating, whether you felt the prison was communicating with you effectively about what was going on. That was in the state system. When we looked at our surveys from the county systems, I'll tell you, here in Philadelphia, 98% of our respondents said that they did not feel safe. So compared to Philly, the state system was doing quite well. I feel like I can go on and on about a million things, and you want to ask questions, so I'll end there.
Thank you so much. So this question, before we dive into, for the folks who are covering this nationally, Claire, what are the other comparable organizations to yours across the country?
Great. I love that. So there are only two of us. In the 1880s, there would have been prison societies in pretty much every single state. But today, there are only three of us remaining. The John Howard Association of Illinois and the Correctional Association of New York. We are the three remaining independent prison monitors and ombuds.
And so I want to start this question with you, Judge Clark, but Ms. Ghandnoosh and Ms. Shubik-Richards, if y'all would also weigh in. Judge Clark, you oversee civil, family, and criminal court. You're talking with prosecutors and public defenders all the time. This conversation about decarceration, how is it taking place? Who buys into it? Who gives you pushback?
So initially the conversation, we just realized we had to do something. We had to get people out of jail. And so nobody gave us pushback, interestingly. Let me just say this. I got a lot of emails, a lot of letters and phone calls to my chambers in two camps. One camp, they thought we should let everyone out of the jail, and then citizens in the community who said we were letting too many folks out of the jail. But in terms of the people who do this work every day, we really didn't have any pushback. It really was kind of a beautiful thing to see it unfold. Everybody work together for with a common goal. And everyone sort of had a different role. I mean, obviously the warden and the staff at the jail were helpful in at least initially identifying those people that were at highest risk in the jail. And then the public defenders in terms of getting motions filed in the defense bar, other defense bar in getting those motions filed. Judge Manning, who initially was hearing the bail hearings, I mean, he worked every day in the beginning of the pandemic because bail hearings and motions, that was one thing that had to happen every day. And so he worked every day and to address those issues, and we got those issues. But our court staff, our pretrial services staff, they were really almost literally working around the clock to try to make this happen. And so, the district attorney agreed that people needed to be out of the jail. So we didn't really get a lot of pushback from people within the system. So it just really kind of worked very well to make that happen. And what we did learn, either Dr. Ghandnoosh or Claire talked about the lessons learned. We decided we didn't have a big crime wave in Allegheny County when we let all these people out of jail. The city wasn't and the county wasn't less safe and I think people feel just as safe. And so going forward now, what can we do to keep this up post-pandemic? We should not only be doing this during the pandemic. So we're now, the second phase is to kind of, let's sit back and figure out how we can move forward. Interestingly enough, our county had gotten a safety and justice grant from MacArthur, and one of our goals, we had a target to reduce the jail population. Well, we exceeded that goal, so now we've set the bar higher for ourselves. And I know personally, I think our county executive would like to just tear down this jail, which is way too big. Somebody said, if you build it, they will come. We all believe we don't need a facility that big. We need to work on something much, much smaller, and just, really focus on only incarcerating people, because when you look at the jail, they're mostly in two categories. There's very few people serving sentences. Most of them are there either awaiting to go to trial, and then they're there being detained on violations. And hopefully not technical violations. They've, been convicted of a crime. They were supervised in the community and they got arrested for another crime. But even we started looking at that population too. When we were doing that, we decided, okay, maybe they are accused of another crime, but what is that crime? We shouldn't just have this sort of default position that if you're on supervision and you get arrested, you should remain in the jail until that's resolved. That doesn't necessarily make any sense. And we know that, we've been able to clear warrants without even somebody coming into the courthouse. They can just pick up the phone and call. At least in the beginning, when we didn't want people coming at all into the courthouses, we had lots of information out, phone numbers. Our website, we had to laugh because we were just throwing things up on the website and it was sort of a mess, because it's like, okay, we need to clean this up, but we were in such a hurry to get things out to the public. We just, we wanted to have things accessible. Every court order I issued is on the website during this pandemic, so people can go look see what I ordered.
Judge
Yes.
Clark, I'm going to jump in just a bit. One, and I want to give the other two a chance to answer if they can, but this question is from Tom Morrow. It's a natural segue from what you were talking about. There's been remote arraignments, other kinds of remote proceedings. How much do you expect that to continue? And the second part of the question for me is, given this climate of revisiting what prosecutors should be doing, do you see the pandemic reshaping prosecutorial moves post?
Well, I would hope so. I don't, I can't really speak for the district attorney, but I think we all have lessons that we've learned about who we should be incarcerating initially, and even after conviction, who should be incarcerated and for how long. And so I think, yes, I think it is reshaping the way we look at things. It has changed sort of our lens and our view of everything. With respect to the virtual hearings, I do think, yes, in some respects, we will continue to do some things virtually. I primarily hear, as a judge, juvenile court cases, which includes delinquency and dependency. And my colleagues and I, not just in Allegheny County, but statewide, who hear those kinds of cases have made an interesting observation. Court participation by parents is actually higher now that they can participate in another way besides coming to the courthouse. And there are many barriers for people to come to court. When I look at juvenile court cases, in particular the child welfare cases, while we have a lot of disproportionality in terms of race and ethnicity, poverty is our biggest common denominator. And so some people to come to court requires bus fare or parking or other things. Our county is big, it's spread out. And so for someone to come downtown in the city of Pittsburgh, when most of my families live out in the Mon Valley region, the city of McKeesport, it's a big effort. And what we've noticed is with higher participation, we get better results because, one, I have more information because I have the parents there and participating in the proceedings and can give me information that no one else can give me. And two, they're getting to hear why I'm making my decisions and why I'm ordering certain things. And it has more of an impact on them. They can hear my explanation for why I've made certain things. And two, you know, as I say, what matters is what's in with the court orders and not necessarily what the probation officer or the caseworker wants you to do. And so they can focus in on what they need to do to meet the goals that are set by the court and get their children returned or get their case closed. So I think we have to allow for that, the ability for people to participate post-pandemic remotely in hearings.
Thank you so much. We're going to move on. We have a ton of questions, and I'm sure the journalists will follow up. They'll have your emails. So Claire, this question is for you. So as you noted that 25% of the questions that the Prison Society gets are about medical care. Have you found that that care has gotten worse or stayed the same during the pandemic?
Yeah, it's gotten worse because the prisons are so strapped right now. All medical providers are strapped. I mean, largely the reason why 25% of the requests that we get are related to medical care is because in the counties and to a lesser degree at the state, the government doesn't have the money to provide community standard medical care for all of the seriously medically vulnerable people and compromised people in prisons. Incarcerating in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, 1% of our adult population, 78,000 people, cost the Commonwealth and the counties a lot of money and a lot of money for healthcare. And they don't have that money. And now it's even more strapped because those already strapped healthcare providers are even more so. Now, there is one exception, one really great exception, which is our state system, instead of charging people the copay during the pandemic, actually paid $5 into everyone's commissary fund if you would agree to a flu shot. And they went cell to cell in all 23 state prisons over a 2-week period and provided flu shots. The Department of Corrections, which is usually very good at tooting its own horn, did not issue a press release about this. We found out about it from people on the inside contacting us to say, is this for real? We're told this is a flu shot. Is it a flu shot, or are they doing some experiment on us for the pandemic? And we confirmed that, yes, it was a flu shot. And the responses that we've been getting back are a lot of very grateful people on the inside and their families. So that is the one instance. And it sort of proves that you can do great different healthcare in prison if you really are dedicated to it.
Ms. Ghandnoosh, can you add to that sort of nationally, stretch that out?
Sure. You know, I was thinking about the questions so far and what else I might be able to say. And I guess one thing I would underscore is the really important role that reporters have in this process of getting the story right, of being able to provide context in terms of where we are now in with regards to the very high incarceration rate that we're trying to chip away at, and the fact that, you know, I think sometimes the use of numbers can be really enlightening and sometimes it can be really misleading. And so some states, for example, that expedite releases for people from prison, like California did, or that New Jersey has done recently, it seems like a really big number of people that are being released. And I think, you know, New Jersey has made some dent in its prison population, but I think it needs to be interpreted in the context of how many people are released from prison in that state every year. So that when you get that figure, then you realize that these efforts so far are not as significant as they might seem. So for example, there are about 600,000 people released from prison every single year. Right? I think that's a really large number. So then when you hear from a particular state, 2,000, 3,000, 10,000 people coming out a little bit earlier, it's important, it's necessary, but a lot more is needed. And I appreciated what Judge Clark mentioned earlier in terms of recidivism information and what we are seeing so far. And what we see so far is very promising. And I think we need to provide context again there of what is a typical recidivism level that we see from people that are released, so that we're not not necessarily expecting people to be saints when they're released. Some people are going to slip up, but we need to, at this point, be balancing both public safety and public health goals, and recognizing that these institutions are not closed. And if there are, if they become hotspots of the virus, that's going to be transported home with the guards into their communities, and how much of a devastating impact that can have, in particular in rural areas where hospital facilities are not well equipped to take in a large number of cases.
So we need to end, but I want to give each of you 30 seconds to sort of whip around and tell the journalists what stories specifically, if you have not already discussed it in your presentations, ought to be covered, what's been in the news that you think needs to be clarified, has been gotten wrong during this COVID period. Judge Clark, we'll start with you.
So I would just say that the whole story needs to be told. Sometimes stories are printed and no one is asking the court or others their perspective or getting sort of the story, things, sort of a reaction. So, we've had some folks say that, they don't have access to courts. When courts are open and we allow people to have access, we've made special accommodations for people to come observe court proceedings because we have to socially distance and everybody can't be sitting in the courtroom. And I just think that sometimes they need the whole story, and sometimes it's kind of a matter of interpretation. For example, sometimes it's the way you report things, like that maybe many people are being held in the jail who have not been convicted of a crime. So that's yes and no. There are people that are there because they've been arrested and they're awaiting trial. But then there's the group of people who have been convicted, but they are being detained because they've gotten arrested for a new crime. And while we need to address that population and look to see if we can let those folks out too, we need to do that too. And then I just think there's other information sort of just from that, everybody is really trying the best that they can. And so it's always a lot of finger pointing and not like, give me a suggestion. I'm always open to suggestions. And I'm never afraid to admit that I'm wrong because I don't know everything. And I work best when I have other people helping me and giving me their level of expertise. So and then I guess the final thing is a lot of people, we've taken great care during this pandemic to carefully craft court orders and, post everything and to try to be open. And I will say I was very disappointed early on in our criminal defense bar, who many of them went on YouTube and made statements that the courthouse wasn't safe. We did have a assistant district attorney who got ill and did pass away. I'm not necessarily, and that's very unfortunate and very sad, but people were not even trying initially to even work remotely. So a lot of the defense bar, I believe, did not read the orders and did not bother to avail themselves of the ability to do remote proceedings. So I think I think we need to make sure that we get the whole story and that we get the different perspectives to understand why maybe I might order something that doesn't quite make sense. Ask me, just ask me. We're open. We answer the phone. We answer emails. So I just think that it's sort of frustrating, especially when we're all working so hard to try to keep people safe. And that's really the goal in this pandemic, whether you're incarcerated or whether you're a lawyer working in the courthouse, court staff, or just any member of the community. So I just think we need to get the whole story in everyone's perspective.
Thank you, Judge Clark. Dr. Ghandnoosh?
I have 3 why questions that I think are worth pursuing. Why did the CDC not recommend decarceration as part of its guidance to correctional facilities? From a public health or criminological perspective, what could explain the absence of that guideline? Because otherwise, correctional institutions have been able to say, well, we're following CDC guidelines, even if they're not exactly, and even if those guidelines are sufficient. Second question that I have is, when interviewing or writing about the decarceration efforts that are happening, ask why are they limited to nonviolent crimes? From a criminological perspective, from a public safety perspective, why is that, given the lower recidivism rates of people with violent convictions? And then the third one is, we're entering the holiday season when there's more consideration from governors and presidents about commutations and clemency. Can we hope to see, and why are we not seeing mass clemency during this pandemic and given the mass incarceration problem that we have?
Thank you so much. Steve? You're muted.
Thank you to all of you. I know Claire had to leave early as well. We have a lot of questions on deck, so we will bundle them, those that have been they've been unanswered, and we'll send them to all our speakers. And then, as we always do, we'll send you back the answers as soon as we get them. We'll take a quick 5 or 6 minute break before we go on to the next group of speakers, so we can check their audio and video, and we'll be back on with you guys very shortly. But thank you again
Thank you.
for participating and your patience.